The clicking of a dozen handguns echoed through the frozen street, but the girl in the yellow jacket didn't flinch. Lee Jae-hyun, the man they called Stoneheart, stepped out of the lead black SUV, his gaze cold enough to match the winter air. He looked at his son, bleeding on the asphalt, and then at the small, trembling girl standing over him like a tiny soldier. In her left hand, she gripped a faded, tattered photo of a man in a tattered uniform. In her right, she held the hand of the Mafia's only heir. The bodyguards moved to push her aside, but Jae-hyun raised a hand, stopping them dead. He had spent 40 years believing that every soul and soul was for sale, but as he looked into Soo-min's defiant eyes, he felt the first crack in his iron resolve. Why was this child risking her life for a boy she didn't know? And why was she looking at a billionaire as if he were nothing? Like, share, and subscribe for more. Kim Suk-jin lived in a world where the air was always filtered, and the floors were made of heated Italian marble that never knew the touch of dust. To the 8-year-old heir of the Lee Empire, the world was a series of tinted windows and velvet-lined back seats. His mornings didn't start with an alarm, but with the silent, practiced arrival of a specialized tutor and a chef who prepared meals balanced to the milligram. He was a boy defined by Stoneheart's shadow, a prince who owned everything but had never actually touched the ground he walked on. Everything in his life was curated, shielded by a wall of black-suited men who moved like shadows and spoke only in the language of security protocols. 3 miles away, across a divide wider than any ocean, Soo-min's world began with the bite of a different kind of cold. At 6 a.m., she wasn't waking up to a chef. She was tightening her yellow winter jacket, the one with the frayed cuffs and the stubborn zipper that always caught on the lining. Her house didn't have heated marble. It had floorboards that creaked in a specific rhythm, a secret map of sound she used to navigate in the dark so she wouldn't wake her mother. While Suk-jin's father, Lee Jae-hyun, was looking at digital ledgers and deciding the fate of city districts, Soo-min was looking at a single, crinkled photograph of her late father. It was her only treasure, a linguistic and emotional anchor in a world that tried to make her feel invisible. Suk-jin's luxury was a fortress designed to keep the world out, but it also kept him in. He sat at a mahogany desk, studying languages he might never use to speak to a real friend, while Soo-min was out in the real soul, learning the linguistic archaeology of the streets. She knew which shopkeepers were kind and which ones used their words like blades. She knew that survival wasn't about the money in your pocket, but the order and routine you built for yourself one unremarkable day at a time. On this particular morning, as the sun struggled to pierce through a heavy, gray mist, these two parallel lives were drifting toward a collision point that no security detail could prevent. Suk-jin was being ushered into a reinforced sedan, complaining about the temperature of his cocoa, while Soo-min was counting her coins to see if she could afford a small treat for her walk to school. One was a boy who had been told he was a king. The other was a girl who had been taught that being invisible was the only way to be safe. They were the prince and the poverty, two ends of a spectrum about to be shattered by a single, violent act of desperation. The transition from the armored warmth of the sedan to the biting reality of the street happened in a heartbeat of shattered glass and screeching tires. It was supposed to be a routine route, a path cleared by Stoneheart's influence, but the syndicate architects had found the one blind spot in the fortress. A heavy delivery truck swerved, T-boning the lead escort car and sending Suk-jin's world into a chaotic spin. Before the air could even settle, the back door of the reinforced sedan was wrenched open not by a protector, but by a man with a clinical, cold efficiency. The boy was pulled from the velvet interior into the freezing air, his blue school uniform a stark contrast to the gray slush on the pavement. But even the best-laid plans of professionals can fray. A sudden surge of mourning pedestrians and a mistimed intervention by a brave but doomed bodyguard turned the abduction into a frantic scramble. In the confusion of shouting and the muffled pops of suppressed gunfire, Suk-jin was dropped. He hit the asphalt hard, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs and sending a sharp, agonizing heat through his ribs, the kind of pain that makes the world go silent. The attackers, pressured by the approaching sirens and the sheer unpredictability of the crowd, retreated into the fog, leaving the crown prince of the Li Empire abandoned in the middle of a deserted alleyway. He sat there, clutching his chest, his face a mask of terror and exhaustion as he realized that for the first time in his life, the black-suited shadows weren't coming to pick him up. The silence that followed was jagged and heavy. Sukjin watched his own breath hitch in the air, a tiny cloud of white that felt like it was the only thing left of him. Then, a splash of color broke through the monochrome gray of the alley. It wasn't the professional black of a syndicate enforcer or the clinical gray of a doctor. It was a bright, defiant yellow. Sumin had been taking her usual shortcut, her school bag heavy on her shoulders, when she saw the boy in the blue uniform crumpled against the wall. To anyone else, he was a high-value target or a dangerous association, but to Sumin, he was just a child who looked exactly how she felt when her father first disappeared, small, broken, and waiting for a rescue that wasn't coming. She didn't run for the police, and she didn't hide behind the rusted dumpsters like the others. Instead, she knelt in the slush, the yellow fabric of her jacket brushing against his expensive wool coat. Her expression wasn't one of pity, but of a steady, quiet determination that mirrored the linguistic archaeology she practiced in her own life, looking for the truth buried under the wreckage. She gripped his shoulder tightly, her hand small but unyielding. "Stay quiet," she whispered, her voice a calm anchor in his rising panic. In that moment, the white snow of the alleyway was no longer just a cold grave. It was the backdrop for a protector who didn't know she was holding the future of Seoul in her hands. The neighborhood didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. Windows that had been cracked open to catch the morning air slammed shut in a synchronized wave of terror. Shopkeepers flipped their open signs to closed with trembling hands, and the stray dogs that usually prowled the gutters vanished into the shadows. They knew that sound, the heavy, rhythmic thrum of high-performance engines echoing against the narrow brick walls. Then came the screech of tires, a sound like a physical blow, as four obsidian-black SUVs swerved into the alley, boxing in the space with the precision of a military strike. The doors opened in perfect unison, and out stepped the men in black overcoats, their faces stone-cold, their hands already reaching for the concealed weight of their sidearms. At the center of the storm stood Lee Jae-hyun. He didn't look like a man whose son was missing. He looked like a god of vengeance descending to claim a debt. His long black coat caught the wind, fluttering like the wings of a predatory bird, and his sunglasses masked eyes that had watched empires rise and fall without blinking. This was Stoneheart in his purest form, a man who believed the world was a machine powered by fear. As he stepped onto the slushy pavement, his enforcers fanned out, guns drawn, scanning the rooftops for the architects of the ambush. They expected to find a tactical team or a rival syndicate holding a ransom note. Instead, they found a splash of yellow. Sumin didn't stand up. She remained on the ground, her knees soaking in the freezing gray water, her body positioned like a human shield between the injured Sukjin and the wall of barrels aimed in their direction. When the lead bodyguard rushed forward to seize the boy, Sumin didn't recoil. She tightened her grip on Sukjin's shoulder and looked the armed man directly in the eye, her expression a mirror of the quiet, unyielding strength her father had taught her. "He's hurt," she said, her voice small but piercingly clear in the sudden silence. "Don't scream. You're scaring him." The bodyguard froze. It wasn't the girl's size that stopped him. It was the sheer, irrational bravery of a child who didn't seem to care about the weapons pointed at her heart. Behind him, Jae-hyun walked forward, the tap of his expensive leather shoes the only sound in the alley. He looked down at the scene. His heir, the boy who carried the weight of the Lee name, trembling in the arms of a girl who looked like she hadn't had a warm meal in days. He saw the way she clutched a tattered photograph in her other hand, using it like a talisman against the darkness of his world. For 40 years, Jae-hyun had used his power to force people to their knees. But here was a child already on her knees who refused to bow. This Stoneheart felt a strange, cold pressure in his chest. He realized that while his men were looking for an enemy, this girl was the only one in the entire city who had looked at his son and seen a person, not a target. He raised a gloved hand, signaling his men to lower their weapons, as the predator and the protector locked eyes in the freezing snow. The sirens were getting louder, a mechanical scream closing in on the alleyway, but inside that narrow corridor of brick and ice, time seemed to have curdled. Lee Jae-hyun reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal overcoat. His movements were slow, deliberate, the movements of a man who had spent his life settling accounts. He pulled out a leather-bound checkbook and a fountain pen that caught the pale winter light like a silver needle. With a flick of his wrist, he scribbled a signature that was worth more than every building on this block combined. He tore the slip of paper away with a crisp, violent sound that made the bodyguards shift their weight. He held the check out towards Soo-min. To the men in black suits, this was the natural conclusion of the event. In their world, every act of service was a transaction, and every trauma had a market value. They watched the girl, their eyes tracking the movement of the paper, waiting for the inevitable grab. They expected the hunger to show on her face, the desperate calculation of a child who knew the price of a gallon of milk and the cost of a winter without heat. One of the enforcers even let out a short, cynical breath, already dismissing her as just another person who would be bought and moved out of the way. "This is for the boy," Jae-hyun said, his voice a low, resonant hum that brooked no argument. "Take it. Buy a house. Buy a life. Get off this street and never look back." He gestured toward the idling SUVs, their exhaust plumes rising like ghosts in the freezing air. "My men will escort you to whatever bank you choose. Consider it a debt settled." The tension in the alley was thick enough to choke on. Suk-jin, still clinging to Soo-min's yellow sleeve, looked between the father he feared and the girl who had saved him. He saw the check, a piece of paper that represented the total sum of his father's stone-heart philosophy. If she took it, the world would return to its proper axis. The rich would be the rescuers, and the poor would be the rescued, paid off and filed away. Soo-min looked at the check. She saw the zeros. She saw the name Lee Jae-hyun embossed in gold at the top. It was more money than her mother would earn in 3 lifetimes of backbreaking labor. She looked at the black SUVs, then at the guns that were now holstered but still present, and finally, she looked back at the tattered photo of her father she still held in her left hand. The wind picked up, swirling the snow around her yellow jacket, making the bright fabric pop against the gray, oppressive wealth of the men standing over her. The bodyguards edged closer, one of them reaching out a hand as if to hurry the transaction along, assuming her silence was merely shock. They didn't realize that Soo-min wasn't looking at the money. She was looking at the man, searching for something in his stone heart that he hadn't even realized he'd lost. Soo-min looked down at the white slip of paper, then back at the man who held the world in a fist of iron. The wind caught the check, fluttering it against the dark fabric of his coat, but her hands stayed at her sides. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the expensive leather of his glove. But she didn't take the fortune. Instead, she gently pushed the check back toward his chest, her touch as light as a falling leaf, but as firm as a mountain. The silence in the alley became absolute. Even the sirens seemed to fade into the background as the bodyguard's eyes widened. No one pushed back against the stone heart. No one turned away a king's ransom. "My father told me that some things have a price, and some things have a value," Soo-min said, her voice steady and rhythmic, echoing the quiet authority of someone who had already lost everything and found they were still standing. She lifted the tattered photo, showing Jae-hyun, the man in the faded uniform, a man who had died with nothing but his honor. He said that if you take money for doing what is right, you aren't a protector anymore. You're just an employee, and I don't work for you. Jae-hyun's composure didn't just slip, it dissolved. For decades, he had navigated a world where every loyalty was bought and every betrayal was a business expense. He had built an empire on the belief that human nature was fundamentally greedy, yet here was a child in a frayed yellow jacket, shivering in the snow, telling him that his billions were irrelevant. She wasn't angry, And she wasn't being dramatic. She was speaking a truth so pure it felt like a physical weight in the cold air. She looked at Sukjin, who was watching her with wide, wet eyes, and then back at the boss. "He's your son, not a debt," she whispered. "Take him home. He needs a father, not a bodyguard." The stone heart felt a fracture run through his soul. In the linguistic archaeology of the streets, he had finally encountered a language he couldn't translate into profit or loss. He looked at the check in his hand, suddenly seeing it for what it was, a cheap piece of paper used to mask his own inability to connect. His enforcers stood like statues, confused by a scenario their training hadn't prepared them for. They were waiting for him to get angry, to demand she take the gift, or to be insulted by the rejection. But Jae-hyun only lowered his hand. He looked at the tattered photo of the man in the uniform and realized that Soo-min was wealthier than he would ever be. She had a clean conscience, a memory worth more than gold, and a spirit that couldn't be caged by his influence. For the first time in his life, the most powerful man in Seoul felt small. Lee Jae-hyun watched the girl in the yellow jacket walk away, her small hand still anchored to Suk-jin's, until they reached the end of the alley where the police perimeter had finally formed. He didn't try to follow. He didn't call out to her. He simply watched the way she navigated the chaos, quiet, invisible, and completely untouchable by the corruption that fueled his world. When his son was finally ushered into the safety of a secondary medical unit, Jae-hyun turned back to his men. The stone heart was back, his face a mask of granite, but the rhythm of his breathing had changed. The air in Seoul felt different now. It no longer smelled like an opportunity for conquest, but like a city that held people he was no longer worthy to lead. Back in the glass and steel fortress of his headquarters, Jae-hyun sat in the darkness of his office, the blank check he had signed still sitting on his desk. He looked at it for a long time before slowly tearing it into a dozen pieces. He realized that Soo-min was right. If he paid her, he would own her, and the world had enough people who were owned. Instead, he summoned his lead architect, the man responsible for the syndicate's deep cover operations and financial trails. But he didn't give an order for a hit or a payoff. He gave an order for a ghost. Over the following weeks, the world around Soo-min began to shift in ways that felt like a series of happy coincidences. The landlord who had been threatening her mother with eviction suddenly received a long-forgotten tax credit that required him to freeze all rents in the building for a decade. The local school announced a new, anonymous scholarship for exceptional community service that covered every cent of Soo-min's future education, including books and a laptop she had only ever seen in magazines. Even the grocery store on the corner began stocking her mother's favorite tea at a price so low it felt like a mistake. Jae-hyun watched these ripples from the tinted windows of his sedan, parked blocks away where no one would recognize him. He became a secret guardian, a silent shadow protecting the only person who had ever looked at him with pity instead of fear. He used his vast, terrifying network not to destroy, but to ensure that the girl in the yellow jacket never had to trade her heart for a meal. He never sent a card, and he never made a phone call. He understood now that the greatest debt he owed was to stay out of her light. As for Suk-jin, the boy began to notice that his father came home earlier. This stone heart began to ask about his day, not as a report on security, but as a conversation between two people who had survived the cold together. One evening, Jae-hyun found his son looking at a new photograph on his bedside table, not of a mansion or a car, but a candid shot of a girl in a bright yellow jacket, smiling in the snow. Jae-hyun placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip no longer a cage, but a support. He had spent a lifetime building an empire, but it took a child who refused a reward to teach him that the only power worth having is the power to protect the things that money can't touch. The debt was paid, not in gold, but in the quiet, unremarkable peace of a girl who remained free.